Ted Kaczynski. In 1971, a man with a PhD in mathematics and a tenure-track position at one of the best universities in America walked away from all of it, moved to a 10 by 12-foot cabin in the Montana wilderness with no electricity and no running water, and disappeared from public life completely. For the next 17 years, he built bombs. He mailed them to university professors and airline executives, and 3 people died while 23 others were left maimed and disfigured. The FBI assigned over 150 agents to the case. They called it Unabomb, short for university and airline bombing, and for nearly 2 decades, they had absolutely nothing. Ted Kaczynski was born on May 22, 1942 in Chicago to a working-class Polish-American family. He entered Harvard at 16, earned his doctorate in mathematics from the University of Michigan, and landed an assistant professorship at UC Berkeley before he was 30. Then, in 1969, without any public explanation, he resigned and vanished from academic life. He briefly lived with his parents, then his brother, before buying a small plot of land near Lincoln, Montana, and building the cabin by hand. No phone line, no plumbing. A wood-burning stove and a bicycle for transportation. By 1978, the bombs started arriving in the mail. The first devices were crude, but they evolved, each package more sophisticated than the last, each one harder to trace. Over 17 years, Kaczynski mailed or hand-delivered 16 explosive devices to targets he selected with cold precision. Sacramento computer store owner Hugh Scruton was killed in December 1985 when he picked up a package left behind his shop. New Jersey advertising executive Thomas Mosser was killed by a mail bomb in December 1994. California Forestry Association President Gilbert Murray died in April 1995 after opening a package addressed to his predecessor. Kaczynski's own journal entry about Scruton's death described it as an excellent and humane way to eliminate somebody, and noted the man probably never felt a thing. The Unabomb Task Force was the largest and most expensive domestic investigation in Bureau history at the time. Agents chased leads across the country for years, profiling everyone from disgruntled academics to airline employees. They analyzed fragments of pipe, slivers of wood, the grain of handwritten address labels. And still, the case went nowhere. Kaczynski was meticulous. He sanded off serial numbers, crafted components by hand, and left almost no forensic trace. The break came in September 1995, when the Washington Post published Kaczynski's 35,000-word manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, after Attorney General Janet Reno endorsed the decision. The gamble was enormous. Publishing a manifesto written by a serial bomber was unprecedented, but it worked. Kaczynski's brother David recognized the writing style, the specific phrasing, the ideological framework, even certain turns of phrase from letters they had exchanged years earlier. He contacted the FBI through a lawyer. On April 3, 1996, agents descended on the cabin in Montana. Inside, they found a live bomb ready to mail, 40,000 pages of handwritten journals, bomb-making components, and enough evidence to close every open case in the Unabomb file. On January 22, 1998, Kaczynski pleaded guilty to 13 federal counts before Judge Garland Burrell to avoid the death penalty. A federal psychiatrist had diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, a diagnosis Kaczynski himself rejected furiously. He received 4 consecutive life sentences plus 30 years. The lead prosecutor told reporters the Unabomber's career was over. Susan Mosser, widow of one of the victims, told the court they should lock him so far down that when he finally died, he would be closer to hell. Kaczynski was sent to ADX Florence, where he spent years on what staff informally called Bombers Row alongside Timothy McVeigh and Ramzi Youssef. He once wrote that ADX was well administered, that the food was good and the facility was quiet. He fought unsuccessfully in court to prevent his Montana cabin from being auctioned off. It sold in 2011, with proceeds going to victim restitution. Diagnosed with late-stage cancer, he was transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, in December 2021. On June 10, 2023, he was found unresponsive in his cell after hanging himself with a shoelace tied to a handicap rail. He was pronounced dead at Duke University Hospital. He was 81 years old. He spent the final decades of his life inside the most secure prison ever built on American soil. But he was not the only person on that corridor with a story that could keep you up at night. Eric Rudolph. On July 27, 1996, while the entire world was watching the Summer Olympics in Atlanta, a 40-pound pipe bomb packed with masonry nails exploded in Centennial Olympic Park. It killed a 44-year-old woman named Alice Hawthorne, triggered a fatal heart attack in a Turkish cameraman named Melih Uzunyal, who had been running toward the blast, and wounded 111 people. For months afterward, the FBI pursued the wrong suspect entirely. A security guard named Richard Jewell, whose life was shattered by public suspicion before he was ever cleared. The real bomber was already planning his next attack. Eric Robert Rudolph was born September 19, 1966, in Merritt Island, Florida. He was raised partly in a community in Shell City, Missouri, that had connections to the Christian identity movement, a white supremacist theology that blended racial ideology with fringe biblical interpretation. He served briefly in the Army before being discharged in 1989 for marijuana use, then settled into work as a carpenter in the mountains of western North Carolina. To most people around him, he was quiet, private, and unremarkable. Between 1996 and 1998, Rudolph carried out 4 bombings across the American Southeast. After the Olympic Park attack, he bombed the Sandy Springs abortion clinic outside Atlanta in January 1997, injuring 7. A month later, he hit the Other Side Lounge, a gay bar in Atlanta, injuring 5 more. Both of those devices were designed with a specific cruelty. They were rigged with secondary explosives timed to detonate when first responders arrived, targeting the very people running in to help the wounded. Then, on January 29, 1998, he bombed the New Woman All-Women Clinic in Birmingham, Alabama. That blast killed off-duty police officer Robert Sanderson and left nurse Emily Lyons with catastrophic injuries she carries to this day. Lyons lost an eye. Nails were embedded so deep in her body that some could never be removed. Rudolph was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list in 1998 with a $1 million reward on his head, and then he disappeared into the Appalachian Mountains. For more than 5 years, he survived alone in the Nantahala National Forest, living off acorns, salamanders, and dumpster scraps, evading one of the largest manhunts in American history. The Bureau deployed tracking dogs, infrared helicopters, federal surveillance teams, and hundreds of agents combing the forest. None of it worked. The mountains had swallowed him whole. On May 31, 2003, a 21-year-old rookie officer named J.S. Postel was on routine patrol in Murphy, North Carolina, when he spotted a thin, bearded man crouched behind a Save-A-Lot grocery store at 3 a.m, scavenging food from a dumpster. Postel detained him. The man gave a false name at first, but it did not take long to confirm his identity. That was how the most wanted domestic terrorist in America was finally caught. Not in a shootout. Not in a raid. Caught by a rookie cop and a dumpster. To avoid the death penalty in 4 separate jurisdictions, Rudolph pleaded guilty on April 13, 2005, and revealed the location of 250 pounds of hidden dynamite as a condition of the deal. He received 4 consecutive life sentences without parole. He released an 11-page statement calling the abortion clinic bombings a moral duty, and quoted scripture, saying he had fought a good fight, finished his course, and kept the faith. Emily Lyons, the nurse who nearly died in Birmingham, looked him in the face at sentencing and told him she had more guts in her broken little finger than he had in his whole body. Rudolph arrived at ADX Florence in August 2005 and remains there as of 2025. He has since self-published a prison memoir called Between the Lines of Drift. He denies any formal ties to the Christian identity movement, though he has never walked back the ideology behind the bombings themselves. And somehow, it gets worse. Because Rudolph was not the only man inside ADX whose crimes were tied to the deadliest day on American soil in the modern era. Zacarias Moussaoui. He is the only person ever convicted in an American civilian courtroom in connection with the September 11th attacks. And the strangest part of his story might be that he was already sitting in a jail cell on the morning those planes hit the towers. Zacarias Moussaoui was born May 30th, 1968 in Saint-Jean-de-Luz, France, to Moroccan immigrant parents. He grew up largely estranged from his father, moved to London in his 20s, and earned a master's degree in international business at South Bank University. It was in London that his radicalization began. He attended the Finsbury Park Mosque under Abu Hamza al-Masri and the Brixton Mosque, both of which were known recruiting grounds for jihadist organizations in the 90s. He eventually traveled to Afghanistan and trained at al-Qaeda's Khaldan camp. In the summer of 2001, Moussaoui enrolled at the Pan Am International Flight Academy in Eagan, Minnesota. His instructors flagged him almost immediately. He paid roughly $8,000 in cash. He wanted to learn how to fly a 747, but showed no interest in the basics. No interest in takeoffs. No interest in landing. Just the controls of a wide-body jet at cruise altitude. The school contacted the FBI. On August 16, 2001, less than a month before the attacks, he was arrested on an immigration violation. His laptop and personal belongings were seized, but a warrant to search them was never obtained before September 11th. 26 days later, nearly 3,000 people were dead. On December 11th, 2001, he was indicted in the Eastern District of Virginia on 6 conspiracy counts tied to the plot. His trial was chaos from the start. He repeatedly fired his attorneys, represented himself erratically, and disrupted proceedings for years in front of Judge Leonie Brinkema. He pleaded guilty on April 22, 2005. Then he took the stand on March 27, 2006, and testified that he and shoe bomber Richard Reed had been assigned to fly a 5th plane into the White House as part of the September 11th operation. Captured al-Qaeda leaders, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed himself, directly contradicted that claim. They described Moussaoui as unstable, unreliable, and prone to exaggerating his own importance within the organization. Whether he was lying to inflate his role or telling a version of truth that others wanted, buried remains disputed to this day. On the stand, he declared he had no regret and no remorse. He shouted that he was al-Qaeda and that his own American lawyers did not represent him. He stated flatly that lying is permitted for jihad. On May 3, 2006, after 7 days of deliberation, the jury rejected the death penalty. Reports suggested the vote ran 11-1 in favor of death for much of the deliberation before a single holdout shifted the outcome. Judge Brinkema sentenced him to 6 consecutive life terms the following day in a courtroom packed with families of September 11th victims. She told him the sentence would deny him the martyrdom he craved, that there would be no great big bang of glory, and that he would never speak publicly again. 5 days later, he filed to withdraw his guilty plea, claiming he now believed he could receive a fair trial with American jurors. The motion was denied. Moussaoui was transferred to ADX Florence on May 13, 2006, under maximum security restrictions. His conviction was upheld by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in January 2010. In 2018, he filed a pro se lawsuit alleging that total isolation at ADX amounted to psychological torture. He has also provided sworn statements in civil litigation accusing Saudi royals, including Prince Turki bin Faisal and Prince Bandar bin Sultan, of financing al-Qaeda. Those individuals deny the allegations, and nothing has been proven in court. He remains at ADX today. To put that plainly, the man convicted of conspiring in the murder of nearly 3,000 people is still alive, still filing legal motions, still sitting in a 7-by-12 concrete cell in the Colorado Rockies. But Moussaoui's role in September 11th ran through conspiracy and planning from the margins. The next inmate's crime predated it by 6 years, and the body count from his attack was the worst act of domestic terrorism in American history. Terry Nichols. At 9:02 on the morning of April 19, 1995, a 4,800-pound truck bomb built from ammonium nitrate, nitromethane, and fuel oil detonated directly beneath the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The blast shattered glass in buildings over a mile away. It killed 168 people, including 19 children in a second-floor daycare center called America's Kids. Some of those children had been pressed against the window that morning, watching the fire trucks go by on the street below. The explosion injured more than 680 others and tore the entire north face off a 9-story federal building, leaving it open to the sky like a cross-section in a textbook. Rescue workers who arrived first described it as a war zone. The man who drove the Ryder truck, Timothy McVeigh, was pulled over 90 minutes later on a traffic stop. He was executed in 2001. But he did not build that bomb alone. Terry Lynn Nichols was born April 1, 1955 in Lapeer, Michigan. He drifted through jobs as a farmer, a grain elevator manager, a ranch hand, and a real estate salesman before a brief Army stint at Fort Benning in 1988, where he met Timothy McVeigh during basic training. The two stayed in contact after Nichols took a hardship discharge in 1989. Both men were radicalized by the Ruby Ridge standoff in 1992 and the Waco siege in 1993. They attended gun shows together. They traded anti-government literature, and they fed each other's hatred of the federal government until it consumed everything else in their lives. Nichols was the logistics man. He stole blasting caps from a quarry in Marion, Kansas. He robbed an Arkansas gun collector named Roger Moore to fund the operation. He purchased 2,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer under the alias Mike Havens. While McVeigh parked that Ryder truck in front of the Murrah building and walked calmly to a getaway car, it was Nichols who had helped assemble the weapon that turned a federal building into a mass grave. He surrendered to police in Harrington, Kansas on April 21, 1995, 2 days after the bombing, claiming he had nothing to do with it. The search of his property told a different story. Investigators recovered blasting caps, ground ammonium nitrate, plastic barrel fragments consistent with the bomb components, 33 firearms, a receipt from a Ryder truck rental bearing McVeigh's fingerprints, and a hand-drawn map of downtown Oklahoma City with the Murrah building circled. And no, I'm not making that up. He kept the map. On December 23, 1997, a federal jury in Denver convicted Nichols of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter for the deaths of federal officers inside the building. The jury deadlocked on the death penalty. On June 4, 1998, Judge Richard Match sentenced him to life without parole, calling Nichols an enemy of the Constitution. But the case was far from over. In 2004, Oklahoma brought state charges. A second jury convicted him on 161 counts of first-degree murder, including 1 fetal homicide count, plus first-degree arson and conspiracy. That jury also deadlocked on death. On August 9, 2004, he received 161 consecutive life sentences, a number so large it entered the Guinness World Records. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Not about the fertilizer purchases under a fake name. Not about the stolen explosives. Not about 2 radicalized men with access to bomb-making materials and a date circled on a map. At sentencing, Nichols apologized to the survivors and the families of the dead. Jannie Coverdale, who lost both of her grandsons in the daycare center, later said she forgave him. Nichols has been at ADX Florence since 1998, where he reportedly converted to a strict Christian faith and shared recreation time on the same corridor as Kaczynski and Youssef. A third man who knew about the plot in advance, Michael Fortier, cooperated with prosecutors, served 10 years, and was released into the Witness Protection Program in 2006. Nichols received no such deal. He remains at ADX today, and that corridor held one more name worth knowing. A man whose failed ambitions in 1993 nearly made September 11th irrelevant, because he tried to bring down the towers first. Ramzi Youssef. On February 26, 1993, at 12:18 in the afternoon, a 1,336-pound urea nitrate bomb detonated in the B2 parking level beneath the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The blast carved a crater 5 stories deep and 150 feet wide. It killed 6 people, including a pregnant woman named Monica Rodriguez Smith, and injured over 1,000. The man who built the device later told investigators his intention was to topple the North Tower into the South Tower and kill 250,000 people in a single morning. He was 24 years old, and he almost got away with it. Ramzi Ahmed Youssef was born April 27, 1968 in Kuwait, to a Pakistani Baloch father and a Palestinian mother. His true name, according to the 9/11 Commission, was Abdul Basit Mahmoud Abdul Karim. He studied electrical engineering at the West Glamorgan Institute in Wales and trained at Al-Qaeda's Camp Khaldan on the Afghan-Pakistan border. He was the maternal nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the man who would later plan and execute the September 11th attacks. Youssef flew into JFK Airport on September 1, 1992, entering the country on a fraudulent Iraqi passport. He claimed political asylum at the gate and was released. From a rented apartment in Jersey City, he spent 5 months assembling the massive device with co-conspirators, mixing urea nitrate and wiring hydrogen cylinders into a bomb designed to shatter the building's foundation. On February 26, 1993, he drove a rented Ryder van into the B2 parking level and walked away. When the bomb detonated, it did not bring the towers down, but it blew a hole through 4 sublevels of concrete, knocked out the building's emergency systems, and trapped tens of thousands of people in smoke-filled stairwells for hours. And it proved something that would echo for the next 8 years. It proved the towers could be hit, and that the will to hit them existed. Yusuf fled the country on a flight to Pakistan that same night. Over the next 23 months, he moved across South and Southeast Asia, allegedly attempted to assassinate Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, and in Manila plotted with his uncle KSM what became known as Operation Bojinka. The plan was staggering in both its ambition and its operational detail. They intended to assassinate Pope John Paul II during his January 1995 visit to the Philippines and simultaneously detonate liquid nitroglycerin bombs hidden beneath airline seats aboard 11 or 12 U.S. commercial airliners flying over the Pacific Ocean. Each bomb would be assembled mid-flight and left under a seat before the bomber deplaned at a stopover. If the plan had succeeded, thousands of passengers would have died over open water, and the death toll would have dwarfed September 11th. On December 11th, 1994, Yusuf tested a smaller version of the device aboard Philippine Airlines Flight 434 from Cebu to Tokyo. The bomb killed 24-year-old Japanese businessman Haruki Ikegami and nearly brought the aircraft down. The full plot was exposed on January 6, 1995, when an accidental chemical fire in Yusuf's Manila apartment sent smoke pouring into the hallway. A responding officer discovered the laptop, along with chemistry equipment and timing devices. On the hard drive, investigators found the operational details of Bojinka laid out in full: flight numbers, seat assignments, timing calculations. He was captured on February 7, 1995 at the Sukasa guest house in Islamabad by Pakistani intelligence officers and American diplomatic security agents acting on a tip from an informant. When agents arrived, he was reportedly calm and offered no resistance. In 2 separate trials before Judge Kevin Duffy in the Southern District of New York, juries convicted Yusuf on September 5, 1996 for the Bojinka conspiracy, and on November 12, 1997 for the World Trade Center bombing. At sentencing on January 8, 1998, Yusuf told the court he was a terrorist and proud of it. He said he supported terrorism against the United States and Israel because, in his words, America invented terrorism and uses it every day. He called Americans butchers, liars, and hypocrites. Judge Duffy called him an apostle of evil and sentenced him to life plus 240 years. That number was not arbitrary. It was calculated from the combined remaining life expectancies of the 6 people who died in the parking garage that day. Duffy recommended that the entire sentence be served in solitary confinement. Yusuf has been at ADX Florence since 1998, federal prisoner number 039110000. According to staff who have worked on his unit, he prays nearly every hour and almost never leaves his cell. His uncle Khalid Sheikh Mohammed went on to plan and execute the September 11th attacks in 2001, finishing what Yusuf had started 8 years earlier. Yusuf showed them the target. Someone in his own bloodline finished the job. He remains at ADX as of 2025, serving a sentence built to last longer than any human life. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Richard Reed. On December 22, 2001, just 3 months after September 11th, a 6'2", 215-pound man boarded American Airlines Flight 63 from Paris to Miami with 197 people on board. Hidden inside his hollowed-out high-top sneakers were enough plastic explosives to blow a hole in the fuselage at 35,000 feet. He had cleared security the day before, but was pulled aside for additional screening and missed his flight. The next day, he passed right through. And the only reason anyone on that plane survived is because his feet were sweaty. Richard Colvin Reed was born August 12, 1973 in Bromley, England. His father was a Jamaican-British career criminal who spent much of Reed's childhood behind bars. His mother was English. Reed grew up without structure, drifting into petty crime as a teenager, and was in and out of juvenile detention before converting to Islam in the early 90s, while incarcerated at Feltham Young Offender Institution. After his release, he gravitated toward the Brixton Mosque and then the Finsbury Park Mosque in North London, where radical cleric Abu Hamza al-Masri was recruiting young men for jihad. By 1999, Reed had traveled to Afghanistan and trained at al-Qaeda camps. Intelligence officials later linked him to September 11th facilitator Jamal Beghel. French police had actually questioned Reed the day before the attack at Charles de Gaulle Airport. They found his appearance suspicious, but ultimately let him board the next day's flight. Roughly 90 minutes after takeoff, flight attendant Hermes Moutardier smelled a burning match. She found Reed hunched over in his seat, trying to light a fuse running into his shoe. When she confronted him, he shoved her away. A second flight attendant, Christina Jones, intervened, and Reed bit her hand hard enough to draw blood. Within seconds, passengers swarmed him. A French doctor on board sedated him with a shot of Valium, while other passengers restrained him with belts and headphone cords. The pilot diverted to Logan International Airport in Boston. The investigation revealed that Reed's shoes had been packed with triacetone triperoxide and PETN, a combination powerful enough to tear through an aircraft fuselage and bring down the plane over the Atlantic. The shoes had been custom modified, the soles hollowed out and filled with plastic explosive, with detonation cord threaded through the lining. Forensic analysts determined the fuse failed because moisture from Reed's rain-dampened, sweating feet had degraded it just enough to prevent ignition. An entire plane of 197 people survived because of perspiration. If the weather had been different the day before, if his feet had been dry, Flight 63 would have broken apart over the ocean. Indicted on 8 federal counts, Reed pleaded guilty on October 4, 2002. At sentencing on January 30, 2003, he told the court he was at war with America and pledged his allegiance to Osama bin Laden. Chief District Judge William Young of Massachusetts responded with what became one of the most quoted judicial statements in modern American history. Young told Reed he was not an enemy combatant. He was a terrorist. Not a soldier in any war, but a terrorist. He said calling Reed a soldier would give him far too much stature. He pointed to the American flag in the courtroom and told Reed that flag would be there long after Reed was forgotten. Young sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms plus 110 years. Reed was sent directly to ADX Florence, where he waged a hunger strike in 2009 protesting the special administrative measures that restricted his communication with the outside world. He won a partial settlement that loosened some restrictions. His attack is the reason airport security in the United States and around the world still requires passengers to remove their shoes before boarding. That single failed attempt permanently changed how hundreds of millions of people travel. Reed remains at ADX, and he was not the last inmate to arrive there after committing an act so extreme that the federal system had no other place to put him. Thomas Silverstein. For 36 years and 7 months, Thomas Silverstein lived in continuous solitary confinement. No other federal prisoner in American history has served a longer stretch in isolation. He was kept in conditions so extreme that an entirely new kind of prison was designed, in part, to hold him. That prison was ADX Florence. Thomas Edward Silverstein was born Thomas Conway on February 4, 1952, in Long Beach, California. He took his stepfather's surname and grew up fast on the wrong side of the law, committing his first armed robbery in 1971. By 1977, he was serving a 15-year federal sentence at Leavenworth, where he was recruited into the Aryan Brotherhood, a connection the Bureau of Prisons documented, but Silverstein always denied. Inside the walls, Silverstein became one of the most feared men in the federal system. He was convicted of killing 3 inmates during his time at USP Marion. D.C. Black's gang member Robert Chappelle was stabbed in his cell in 1981. Gang leader Raymond Smith, known as Cadillac, was stabbed 67 times in September 1982 with help from another prisoner named Clayton Fountain. A third conviction, for the killing of inmate Danny Atwell in 1980, was later overturned after the key witness was found to have committed perjury. But the killing that sealed Silverstein's fate happened on October 22, 1983. While being escorted in handcuffs from the shower at Marion's H Unit, Silverstein, with help from another inmate who slipped him a homemade key and a shank through the bars, freed himself from his restraints and stabbed corrections officer Merle Klutz approximately 40 times in the corridor. Klutz was 51 years old. He was a senior officer specialist with years of experience. He died on the concrete floor of the control unit while other inmates watched. Hours later, in what appeared to be a coordinated action, Clayton Fountain killed a second officer, Robert Hoffman, in a nearly identical attack in the same unit. 2 officers dead in one day at the same facility. The Bureau of Prisons had never seen anything like it. Because federal law at the time carried no death penalty for killing a corrections officer, the Bureau of Prisons did the next closest thing. Director Norman Carlson placed Silverstein under an unprecedented designation of no human contact. It was not a temporary punishment. It was permanent. He was held in a windowless underground cell at USP Atlanta, where conditions were designed to ensure he would never touch another human being again. In 1987, Cuban detainees rioting at Atlanta briefly freed him from his cell during the chaos, but he was retaken without incident. He was later moved to Leavenworth, and then in 2005 to ADX Florence's Range 13, where the lights in his cell stayed on around the clock, and his meals arrived through a slot in the door. Guards across the system refused to speak with him out of respect for Officer Klutz. A federal judge called Silverstein and Fountain masters of prison murder. Silverstein's legal challenges went nowhere. In 2014, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the dismissal of his Eighth Amendment lawsuit, acknowledging that over 30 years in solitary was an extraordinary length of time, but ruling it did not constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Joanne Klutz, the widow of the officer Silverstein killed, publicly opposed any relaxation of his isolation. In the decades that followed, Silverstein taught himself to paint and practiced Buddhism. He wrote about his experience, describing the minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, and years dripping away constantly, with no end or relief in sight. He apologized to the Klutz family in 2011. Silverstein died on May 11, 2019, at a hospital in Lakewood, Colorado, following complications from heart surgery. He was 67 years old. He had spent 36 years and 7 months in continuous solitary confinement, a record in the federal system that no one has matched. The conditions of his isolation became a prototype. The prison built to manage men like him became the prison that now holds everyone else on this list. And that prison still holds one more inmate whose case remains active, whose appeals are not finished, and whose sentence carries a punishment the others on this list were spared. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. On April 15, 2013, Two pressure cooker bombs detonated 12 seconds and 210 yards apart near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed. 264 were injured. 17 lost limbs. Among the dead was an 8-year-old boy. The man convicted of building and placing those bombs was a 19-year-old college student who just hours after the attack went back to his dorm room and logged onto social media as if nothing had happened. Dzhokhar Anzorovich Tsarnaev was born July 22, 1993 in Kyrgyzstan and raised in Dagestan before his family obtained U.S. asylum in 2002. He graduated from Cambridge Ringe and Latin School, where classmates remembered him as a popular wrestler and a laid-back kid. He received a city scholarship and enrolled at UMass Dartmouth as a nursing student. On the afternoon of April 15th, he and his older brother Tamerlan, who was 26, placed 2 homemade bombs packed with BBs, nails, and ball bearings near the crowded finish line on Boylston Street. The devices were built from pressure cookers using instructions published in Al-Qaeda's Inspire magazine. The first blast killed 29-year-old Crystal Marie Campbell and 23-year-old Boston University graduate student Lingzi Liu. The second killed 8-year-old Martin Richard, whose father Bill later testified at trial. The scope of the injuries was staggering. First responders described a scene of devastation that looked like a battlefield. 3 days later, the brothers murdered MIT police officer Sean Collier, who was 26, shooting him in his cruiser as he sat in his patrol car on the MIT campus. They carjacked an SUV, told the driver they were the marathon bombers, and engaged Watertown police in a running firefight, during which homemade explosives were thrown from the vehicle. During the chaos, Dzhokhar ran over his own brother while fleeing in the stolen SUV, fatally injuring Tamerlan. After a region-wide shelter-in-place order that shut down metropolitan Boston for an entire day, Dzhokhar was discovered hiding and bleeding inside a covered boat in a Watertown backyard on the evening of April 19th. He had scrawled messages on the interior walls of the boat, calling the victims collateral damage and invoking jihad. He was captured alive. In a Mirandized confession, he stated he and his brother had also planned to bomb Times Square. The trial before Judge George O'Toole in the District of Massachusetts was one of the most closely watched federal proceedings in years. Attorney General Eric Holder authorized capital prosecution in January 2014. Defense attorney Judy Clark conceded her client's guilt at opening statements, acknowledging the facts were incomprehensible and inexcusable, but arguing that Dzhokhar had been radicalized and led by his older brother. It did not matter. On April 8, 2015, the jury convicted Tsarnaev on all 30 counts. On May 15, 2015, they sentenced him to death on 6 of those counts. He was transferred to ADX Florence on July 17, 2015, under a Bureau of Prisons determination, citing unique security management requirements. He was placed there instead of the standard federal death row at USP Terre Haute. In June 2016, Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri reportedly warned of consequences if Tsarnaev were harmed. His appeals have stretched on for years. The First Circuit vacated his death sentence on July 31, 2020, with Judge O. Roger A. Thompson writing that Tsarnaev would spend his remaining days locked up with the only remaining question being whether he would die by execution. The Supreme Court reinstated the death sentence 6-3 on March 4, 2022. Justice Clarence Thomas wrote that Tsarnaev committed heinous crimes and that the Sixth Amendment guaranteed him a fair trial before an impartial jury, and that he received one. As of late 2025, the First Circuit has ordered further investigation into juror bias claims and the case remains unresolved. Tsarnaev sits on federal death row at ADX Florence. His legal battle is still ongoing. His sentence has not been carried out. But not every inmate inside ADX arrived there for a crime committed in public view. Some came from a world where the killing happened quietly, behind closed doors, and went undetected for years. Michael Swango. He graduated valedictorian of his high school class, earned his chemistry degree summa cum laude with the American Chemical Society Award, and completed medical school at Southern Illinois University. His patients kept dying, and nobody stopped him for over a decade. By the time the federal government finally caught up with him, the trail of bodies stretched across 3 states, 2 countries, and as many as 60 victims. Michael Joseph Swango was born October 21, 1954 in Tacoma, Washington, and raised in Quincy, Illinois. His father was an alcoholic Vietnam veteran Army officer. Swango served in the Marine Corps, received an honorable discharge, and entered medical school, where classmates began calling him 00 Swango, because patients in his care kept having sudden, unexplained crises. He nearly was expelled for falsifying patient records, but graduated and began a surgical internship at Ohio State University Medical Center in 1983. At Ohio State, the pattern accelerated. Multiple patients suffered sudden cardiac emergencies that could not be medically explained. Nurses began noticing that patients who had been stable would crash without warning shortly after Swango entered their rooms. Among the dead was 19-year-old gymnast Cynthia Ann McGee, who died on January 14, 1984, after Swango administered a lethal potassium injection. The hospital investigated internally, found enough concern to quietly drop Swango from the program, but never reported the deaths to law enforcement. A 1985 report by Law Dean James Meeks later tore that investigation apart as negligent and inadequate. But by then, Swango had already moved on to his next target. Working as a paramedic back in Quincy in 1984, he poisoned 5 co-workers by lacing donuts and iced tea with arsenic. When police searched his apartment in October of that year, they found ant poison, handwritten recipes for ricin, botulism toxin, and supersaturated cyanide solutions, along with survival knives, firearms, and books on Nazism. He was convicted of aggravated battery in August 1985 and served just 2 years of a 5-year sentence. And somehow, it gets worse. After his release, Swango used forged credentials to resume practicing medicine. He briefly became engaged to a nurse named Kristen Kinney, who grew suspicious of him and later took her own life. In 1994 and 95, he worked at Maneni Lutheran Mission Hospital in Zimbabwe, where at least 5 patients died after he injected unknown substances into their IV bags. A local lawyer named David Coltart investigated the deaths, but Swango left the country before charges could be filed. In June 1997, Swango was arrested at Chicago O'Hare Airport while en route to a hospital job in Saudi Arabia. He pleaded guilty to defrauding the VA and served 42 months. Days before his scheduled release in July 2000, federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York charged him with murdering 3 patients at the Northport VA Medical Center on Long Island in 1993. The victims were George Ciano, Aldo Serini, and Thomas Samarco. Their exhumed remains tested positive for poison. Zimbabwe simultaneously filed charges for poisoning 7 patients, 5 of them fatally. On September 6, 2000, Swango pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder plus fraud before Judge Jacob Mishler, accepting the deal to avoid the death penalty and extradition. Prosecutors read passages from his personal notebook aloud in court, including entries where he described the sweet, close smell of an indoor homicide and the pleasure he took in killing. Mishler sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms without parole. In a separate proceeding in Franklin County, Ohio, on October 18, 2000, he pleaded guilty to the aggravated murder of Cynthia Ann McGee and received a 4th life sentence. Author James B. Stewart, whose book Blind Eye documented the case, estimated that circumstantial evidence connects Swango to roughly 35 deaths. Investigators believe the actual number may approach 60, which would make him one of the most prolific medical serial killers in recorded history. He requested placement at ADX Florence himself after being stabbed by another inmate at a lower security facility. He remains there at age 71. The men on this list arrived at ADX for acts of terrorism, for killing corrections officers, for poisoning patients. But the final name on this list came from a different world entirely. The world of organized crime, and his story is the only one that ends outside the walls. Anthony Casso. For nearly a decade, the underboss of the Lucchese crime family had 2 NYPD detectives on a $4,000 monthly retainer. They fed him the names of informants. They carried out hits on his behalf. They were the most corrupt cops in New York City history, and Anthony Casso was the man writing the checks. Anthony Salvatore Casso was born May 21, 1942 in South Brooklyn. His father was a longshoreman with a burglary record from the 1940s. His godfather was Genovese Capo Salvatore Calimbrano. Casso dropped out of school at 16, joined the South Brooklyn Boys street gang, and was recruited into the Lucchese family by Capo Christopher Fernari. After the landmark commission trial of 1986 gutted the leadership of New York's 5 mafia families, Lucchese boss Anthony Corallo handed control to Vittorio Amuso and Casso. Casso served first as consigliere, then as underboss from 1989. He was a hands-on operator in a way most bosses avoided. He confessed involvement in anywhere from 15 to 36 murders depending on the source, and nobody who worked with him doubted those numbers. He also ran what federal prosecutors called one of the 5 families' biggest moneymakers after drug trafficking, a massive gasoline tax evasion scheme operated in partnership with Brighton Beach kingpin Marat Balagula and the Russian mob. Among the most notorious was the April 13, 1986, car bombing that killed Gambino underboss Frank DeCicco. The device, built by Genovese munitions expert Herbert Pate, was actually meant for John Gotti in retaliation for the murder of Gambino boss Paul Castellano. Casso was also linked to the killing of Gambino associate Roy DeMeo in 1983 and the 1986 murder of Russian mobster Vladimir Reznikov outside the Rasputin nightclub in Brighton Beach. But the most dangerous weapon in Casso's arsenal was not a bomb or a gun. It was a pair of NYPD detectives named Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa. Starting in 1986, Casso paid them $4,000 a month to provide intelligence on federal informants and active investigations. The detectives did not just pass information. They personally carried out murders on Casso's orders. At least 8 people were killed by or with the direct involvement of Ippolito and Caracappa, including Gambino capo Edward Lino, who was shot on the Belt Parkway on November 6, 1990. The case of the so-called mafia cops became one of the most infamous police corruption scandals in American history. Both detectives were eventually convicted in 2009. After his September 1990 indictment in the Windows case racketeering probe, Casso went on the run for 31 months. During that time, he continued ordering violence from hiding. A May 8, 1991 assassination attempt on suspected informant Peter Chiodo involved 12 bullets, but Chiodo survived. When Chiodo would not cooperate with Casso even after the shooting, Casso ordered an arson attack on the home of Chiodo's 95-year-old grandmother. That's not a typo, by the way. His grandmother. Casso was arrested on January 19, 1993, at his girlfriend's home in Mount Olive, New Jersey. He flipped almost immediately, pleading guilty in March 1994 to a 72-count agreement covering 14 murders, racketeering, and extortion. His debriefings provided the information that eventually brought down Ippolito and Caracappa, but Casso could not help himself. In October 1997, the U.S. Attorney's Office terminated his cooperation agreement. He had been caught bribing guards, smuggling contraband into prison, assaulting other inmates, and most damaging of all, fabricating testimony to implicate rival mobsters in murders they did not commit. He tried to frame Sammy Gravano, the Gambino underboss turned government witness, among others. Prosecutors who had spent years building cases from his debriefings concluded that his testimony could not be trusted. The deal that might have saved him decades was torn up. On June 30, 1998, Judge Frederick Block in the Eastern District of New York sentenced Casso to 13 consecutive life terms, plus 455 years. One investigator described him as a ruthless, homicidal maniac who enjoyed killing. In a 2006 letter to the New York Post, Casso complained that the federal government had downplayed his cooperation. The letter did not generate much sympathy. Casso began his sentence at ADX Florence before being transferred through a series of federal medical facilities for prostate cancer treatment. He was moved to FMC Butner, then FMC Springfield, then USP Terre Haute, and finally USP Tucson beginning in March 2020. A compassionate release motion was denied in November 2020. Judge Block cited the danger Casso still posed. Anthony Casso died of COVID-19 complications at USP Tucson on December 15, 2020. He was 78 years old. He is the only person on this list whose life ended outside ADX, and the only one who died from something other than old age or his own hand. A virus did what the Gambino family, the FBI, and 2 decades of prison could not. ADX Florence holds the men the rest of the prison system could not contain. Bombers, assassins, a doctor who poisoned his patients for pleasure, and a mobster who put cops on his payroll. They were sent to the last stop in the federal system, and for most of them, that is exactly where they will stay. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.